All right, thanks, Laura. Thanks, folks, for being here. Always love to do these little presentations for SoftEd. Um, I'm Chris. I am essentially one of the facilitators of AI workshops and learning programs for SoftEd. So particularly around generative AI and even more particularly around specific job roles and specific issues and impacts of AI, mostly in large organizational environments. But um, I've been an AI watcher and an AI community member for just about 20 years now. So long before the current boom of specifically generative AI. And that is really my world, machine learning and implementation of business solutions that leverage machine learning and AI-based technologies. So I'm also a technology strategy coach and an IT team coach and a business coach. So I was very pleased to be able to present some of my own learning. As Laura said, this is a rapidly evolving space, and we're all learning together. So I do ask that you approach the next few minutes in this spirit. All right. So as always, I've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to be quite brisk. Hopefully not too brisk. If you need me to slow down, you can tell me. But I do like to prioritize delivering as much valuable material to you as I can. And so sometimes it does get a bit fast, but apologies in advance if I start sounding like a little bit of a motor mouth. All right, so quickly, these are the main groups that we're going to cover for today's topic. Today's topic is compliance and legal arena issues around AI. We'll touch on a couple other adjacent issues. If I have time, I'd like to say just one word or two about the cybersecurity aspect of AI, some things to consider, because really what we're talking about overall here is the umbrella of risk management. So when we talk about compliance and ethics and privacy and legal issues, really what we're trying to do is identify, mitigate, protect ourselves and our organizations against risks. And there's plenty of risks associated with generative AI, or really with any kind of emergent technology that's being adopted at a breakneck pace. And that certainly does describe generative AI. Now, before I get going here, I always like to hear a little bit from you guys. So I'm just going to quickly ask you guys a couple of questions in the polls. And we'll just do these really quickly. But the first one is, I'm interested to find out from the group here today if you or your organization have any type of formalized generative AI initiatives underway. And there's just a couple of questions around generative AI and related adjacent topics. Not all of these are integral to generative AI, but they are very close and probably will be integral if you're actually going to implement any type of an enterprise solution for generative AI. So see those responses coming in. Thank you very much. I'll give it just another few minutes here. I can see right away that we do have initiatives around pretty much all of the things listed, and it's a pretty even spread. So thanks to everybody who's responding. It's starting to slow down a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and I will share these results with everybody just for a moment. So I think the interesting thing about this is you can see that, there are some responses falling into all of these buckets, and I think that's noteworthy. Generative AI, interestingly, the biggest bucket, even around our kind of incumbent buckets of agility and DevOps, which have been ramping up for a number of years now. So that's interesting. Okay, one more poll for you guys before I get into the content for today. Oh, and Aaron says there was no option for no, so hopefully you didn't answer at all. But I guess I really did. I only left room for the people who had a yes to one of those. So let's see here. Now, the next poll is regarding AI policy. And I want to just take a moment here to ask about AI policy. Again, to Aaron's point, there may be no option for no, but I'm still curious. And this one is actually directly relevant to today's poll. And as you can see, you actually do have a no option here. So this is a short poll. Just leave this up for a moment. And we'll get a sense for our peers here in the group today around exactly what the organization's take is on working the new technology of generative AI into policy and governance. So good. Good spread of responses coming in here. Again, a pretty good mix, I think, anywhere from there's no policy to there is a policy, or there's a policy which bans generative AI. So those are pretty typical. I'm just going to stop that one, and I'll share these results for a moment. All right, so thanks very much, everyone, for those responses. I think that's useful feedback. It certainly is for me. So when I think about legality issues and risk mitigation issues and legal issues and ethics issues and things like that, for me, I kind of think that they fall into really the generative AI issues fall into a relatively small handful of buckets. And so these buckets are kind of enumerated here. You've got a big bucket with a lot happening right now around copyright and intellectual property. So that's a big one. Secondly, you've got a big bucket around legality specifically associated with data privacy. And related to that is data compliance. And there's other, I think, edge cases around legality and compliance, but as we'll see here in a moment, most of these issues are around data. So then we have just the broader umbrella bucket of risk management and the technology adoption. What else can go wrong? That kind of a question. And of course, there are legal congruencies with all of these issues. And then finally, these are a couple of examples, but things like fraud detection and prevention, but more broadly, cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is probably obviously deserves its own webinar when it comes to generative AI. But these are some of the biggest buckets. I'm not saying this is a comprehensive list, but that's most of them. And you'll see these themes come through again and again over the next 30 minutes or so. So for today, I figured, there are so many themes associated with this conversation. And also, I certainly have knowledge to share here. It's an area of intense interest for me, and I'm learning more all the time. But I don't know that it would be correct for me to claim to be a legal expert when it comes to emergent technology. Certainly, I encounter these issues a lot. I think about them a lot, but I'm not a lawyer. So I thought, I will just start today with basically the main things as I think about them off the top of my head, and then we'll talk a little bit more about them, right? So a couple of slides with main things here. First and foremost, I'm not qualified to give legal advice, right? So nothing I say here should be construed as legal advice. I'm just sharing my research, sharing my learnings, but I'm not a lawyer, and I can't practice law or do any kind of legal advice. And then the other big point here, which Laura actually made right from the top of the introduction, and I think this is probably, if there's just one big takeaway, this is it. These things are revolving every day. I mean, I think, just this morning on the news, I heard the story about Tyler Perry, and there's a legal concern going on there related to generative AI. Last week it was Taylor Swift and her the deepfake social attack that she was subjected to. I mean, there are lawsuits going on right now, and there's very few precedents. So it is a bit like the Wild West out there, as for a while it always is with any kind of emergent technology that people see the promise of tremendous value from, but the rest of the social contract hasn't had time to catch up, right? So finally, I'll present you with what I thought was a really good survey. Salesforce conducted this survey related to generative AI. Won't go through these one by one, but this gives you a snapshot of what some of the most prominent IT leaders and directors in industry responded to Salesforce's survey questions here. But I think what you see if you scan these data points is that there is intense interest and there is intense and concrete initiatives moving forward. And if they're not moving forward yet, then almost all enterprise IT leaders say they are certainly planning to embrace some kind of initiative. They have plans for it. They have plans and opinions about some of the specifics of the ingredients of the technology. And they have some concerns as well. So some of the concerns you see reflected in the survey here bias, security risks, carbon footprints, and sustainability. Privacy issues, but nonetheless, you can see that the majority of IT leaders not only plan to move forward with some sort of generative AI initiative in the business, but they actually plan to prioritize that type of initiative. So just a word from senior IT leaders. All right. And then my final slide for the main things here. I think these are just some of the main things that I notice as I think about and research these issues. When you think about legal and audit risks, if you trace back some of the root causes, and always interested in identifying root causes, one of the main root causes is a lack of data governance. So if you have heard terms like master data management or master data governance or the data lifecycle and management of that lifecycle, that's not just about AI, but it is foundational to AI, and it's foundational to all sorts of other technology risks. And it's a really important common denominator to scrutinize. So if there's no good data governance, then that's going to open up all kinds of risks, and it's going to erode trust with customers and stakeholders. Secondly, AI has a black box problem, and that's important for the legal issue, because black box problem means that some of the technology and the way it works is just downright not explainable, even to the people who created it. So that's an issue that's very much being talked about, but that presents obviously issues for auditability, traceability, controls and trails of accountability and things like that. Thirdly, data sets, and we're going to talk a lot about data sets throughout the rest of the talk. Data sets always have biases baked in. Now, that is not a value judgment. It's not even saying it's a bad thing. It's just something, it just means that it's something there to acknowledge, and it's good to try to identify those biases so that you can manage them. Are we still good, Laura? I just saw your chat. I want to make sure. Okay. All right. Sounds like that was on Laura's end. No big deal. Going to keep trucking ahead here. All right. Thanks for that confirmation in the chat. So biases in data always, that's not saying anything good or bad. And what's bad is not to identify the bias and not to manage it intentionally. Fourthly, it is the Wild West. There are barely any precedents. There are some precedents, and I'll share some of those. But watch the space closely, because precedents are kind of dropping all the time. Next point, the IP rights is a real issue, and as of right now, I think whether it's generative AI tools either claiming IP rights or there's just no rights at all, the point here is that it can be very difficult to claim any type of IP rights based on the usage of AI tools, and especially if content or material is created explicitly by the AI. It's very problematic, especially in the US. And then the training data is a big issue here. I'm going to gloss over that because we'll talk quite a bit more about that here. All right. So as a matter of fact, right now. So training data. This is a slide that I use all the time in these presentations. Some of you may have seen them before, but generative AI, it can only do what it does because it is able to ingest and learn from gigantic data sets. So training data is where the functionality of this technology starts. In order to generate or create new things, it has to be able to look at the old things, and then it's essentially just a fancy set of predictive algorithms that allows the computing to generate similar types of outcomes at a very sophisticated level. So that's basically it, right? You don't have any generative AI without extensive machine learning, and you don't have extensive machine learning without very large amounts of training data. So the training data is the precursor to generative AI. Now, a few issues that I always like to point out here. You've got risks. Anytime you're dealing with data, you've got risks. And when you have to manage huge amounts of data, and parse and govern and ensure compliance, well, those big data sets can become much more difficult to manage. So you've got risks associated with that. You've got policy restrictions at the organizational level. Even in the poll we just saw, We have some policies in our own workplaces that prevents the usage of tools like ChatGPT, and there's good reasons for that, right? So the flip side of that is we can only get the benefit of generative AI tools if we have private versions of them that protect us from some of these compliance and policy risks. The most obvious one being that in order to use public generative AI tools like ChatGPT, you have to give your data to some other entity. You're giving your data to Google. You're giving your data to OpenAI or someone like that. And then finally, public tools just may not suit the business requirements of our organization. So those are some issues. But let's make sure we're keeping the conversation centered today around the legal and compliance and ethical concerns. But as ever, any conversation about generative AI starts with a discussion of training data. And in fact, a lot of the issues around legality and compliance and policy also begin with the training data. So you don't have to look any further than issues concerning the data that the models are trained on to identify some immediate common denominators or foundational issues to what may, at a second or third order of consequence, lead to specific legal issues or specific questions about governance, right? So a lot of the data that is used to train most of the, at least the out-of-the-box ChatGPT style tools, Gemini, Claude, Perplexity, and the image generators like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney and tools like that, DALL-E is OpenAI's. So a lot of this training data comes from open source data sets. So it's freely available, and that's obviously one of the big appeals of wanting to be able to use this for a commercial product, right? There's just the type of data that the machine learning algorithms need. It's not super common, and it's not always large enough, right? So it's good to look at this data. So we've got basically two large batches of open source data set specifically for training machine learning models for generative AI applications. One is for the language-based models. I mean, they're actually both language-based models, but one is for generation of language and text-based content, and then one is for generation of image-based content. So for things like GPT, this is the provenance of the data. Now, this is actually fairly out of date at this point. This is the data for GPT-3. So, that was actually, 2 generations ago. The GPT models have come a long way since then. I've got some statistics around how much data GPT-4 was trained on, but OpenAI has become quite protective about the provenance of the data. So it can be very difficult to find any kind of concrete information about exactly what they're using to train these models. But so one of the best summations we know is this one here, right? And these are basically just huge repositories of internet data with some books and then some other slightly curated data sets. And then they take these data sets and they subject them to intensive curation, and they actually winnow them down quite a bit. So, they don't just dump all this data into the model and let it go nuts. They have to curate it very carefully, winnow it down, and they exert a lot of control and a lot of design around exactly how and what parts of this data they're going to train it on. So the common crawl data sets basically just like a snapshot of the internet going back many years. And then, something like Wikipedia, books, we understand this. Web text too, that's a data set. If I remember correctly, I believe that's an export of all Reddit thread data for responses that got 2 or more upvotes. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. This is Reddit data, right? So user-generated data. So it's all very organic. It's very organic. It's not designed. It's just, the world as it is. Okay, so the image-based generators are trained on a different data set. This is called the Lion data set. The most recent one is called, I believe it's Lion 5B. This is a company in Germany. It's an open source product. And this is 400 million what they call image caption pairs. So you've got images that then have been tagged with some text that kind of says what the image is, right? Now, the training data immediately gets very problematic with this one, and there actually have been some lawsuits around this. But when when this data set was scrutinized, what they found was that, because they scraped 400 million images off of the internet. Many of these images they were not even open source images. They were quite indiscriminate. There was also PII and private and sensitive data included in those images. There were inappropriate images, and in some cases there were actually a relatively large number of illegal images, and I mean like really illegal, like I'm not even going to name them on this webinar, but stuff that was not okay. And then there was also fairly blatant violation of rights usage, and licensing. So these data sets were ingested into tools like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, and used to create, these really amazing tools, but baked into the training data, were all of this problematic content. So when the machine is learning based on this content, you can see how that's going to translate to problems, right? So another couple of considerations, despite just being, you got a snapshot of the entire internet going back to 2008 or whatever it is. Well, all kinds of stuff is on the internet. I mean, have you all been on the internet? Have you seen what people put on the internet? So it's not hard to imagine issues with the training data, but there's some other issues as well with this, which is that just because a data set is free or open source, or just because something is free to use, that doesn't mean that it's not governed by rights or by licensing or something like that. And so that's just something to be aware of, right? If it just because something is there for free, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're just free to use it in whatever way you want. But even as we're identifying these considerations, the generative AI tools are just so cool. They're just so useful that our business users are just going to continue adopting these at a breakneck pace, right? ChatGPT, fastest adoption rate for any technology ever. Businesses are scrambling, tripping over themselves to integrate these services into their products, to figure out how to make money with this technology, to build new products and to ramp up new features that leverage these services. It's a huge gold rush, and there a lot of times if we deploy, if we build now, ship first, ask questions later, sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's good to have that kind of bias towards action. But in these types of situations, you can get into trouble, right? So just a couple other considerations there. All right, so let's talk for just a moment about one of the most important subsets, and I'll buzz through this, but that's the question of intellectual property and copyrights, because so many of the issues flying around are related to this. All right, so I think the first thing to know is that as of right now, especially in America, there's very few precedents here. So what that means is that as things start to matriculate through the courts and precedents start to drop, the first stop for courts making rulings on those things will most likely be around existing precedents and existing law, right? Because that's always what the courts want to do, favor existing precedent. So what they'll do is they'll look at the precedents that currently govern, the types of issues that came before this. And the biggest one for that is what is known as fair use, right? So fair use is a rights management legal precedent that says essentially that you can't directly copy somebody else's IP, you can't directly use, you can't steal people's IP, etc. But that doesn't mean that you can't use their creation altogether. It just has to be used for something that you then take, you refactor it enough, you change it enough, so that there's some new dimension of originality there. You're not just stealing and copying and pasting somebody else's work. So fair use is in play all the time. So there's a big question here then, because so much of that's actually their definition of what the generative AI tools do, right? They take other people's work, human created content, and then it gets all put into a blender, and then what comes out the other side is dramatically modified, so much so that it can appear unique. Although there was a lawsuit, I think one of the biggest lawsuits in this space, from late last year. This was brought by the New York Times, in which some generative AI output was explicitly recognizable, word for word as New York Times content. So that was, obviously one of the most egregious examples. But it does happen. It becomes more murky when it's harder to identify, or kind of looks or feels like, hey, that seems like maybe it was built on some of my content, but I can't be sure, or I can't prove it. So how do they determine this? How will courts interpret what we call a sufficiently transformative level of usage so that fair use applies? So there is one of very few existing precedents. Google defended itself successfully a while back in the case of which it was scraping web content, or it was actually scraping book content. So copyrighted content, somebody else's IP, in order that they could provide features for their search service. So they were able to argue that, well, this fair use was in play. It was sufficiently transformative. They weren't, explicitly infringing on somebody's IP. So will that precedent hold here? It's not quite the same thing, but, certainly, these big companies are going to cite precedents like this. So in terms of mitigation, things to think about here is that if these precedents drop and you've already not thought about this, and they're, the fair use kind of falls on the side of, what you haven't done, or you perhaps have done, then all of a sudden you could be willful for infringement. If they find that data sets have used unlicensed content or problematic content, and it's not covered by fair use, then all of a sudden any business services and things using this, could suddenly be liable, right? So another one that has to do with working this into terms and contracts and things like that. And you should ask your providers. So if we're integrating services features from providers, we should make sure that these terms are explicitly laid out, and you should ask for disclosure around whether or not models were trained on unprotected content. So data provenance is a theme that comes up again and again. So you work, and then, you want to work those terms in so that you're protected, right? If you can't achieve documentation or traceability around the data provenance, you can't receive assurance that there's not any landmines baked into the training data, then perhaps avoid those providers, right? So then the other thing to talk about related to IP and copyright is around patents, because patents really, in some ways, copyrights are, they're important, but if you think about the big money is around patents. So patents establish monopoly power for 10 years or, long time. And so again, the law is going to start with interpretation around these new questions around AI generated material. They're going to start with sort of existing law. And the biggest law there starts with the fact that according to the USPTO, at least in America, they stipulate, well, only a human can be an inventor, right? A new invention, a new innovation can only be created if you're a person. So only people can get patents. So you can see right away how we're already in murky territory. Now, they did come out with some clarification recently that explicitly said, work created by AI can't be patented or copyrighted. Only people-generated work can be copyrighted or patented. But they say that augmented, AI-assisted work that still sort of has a human in the driver's seat, that can be patented or copyrighted. But the big problem here is that there's still a lot of gray area. Where do you draw the line, right? Also, you can imagine how maybe if a pharmaceutical company, has some trials or some scientists who are creating a new drug or a new sort of molecules, they could use AI for a lot of the grunt work that leads up to the final stretch of work, and then maybe you're okay. But I think, especially when you get into life sciences, health sciences, engineering fields where the components and the creative process is very mechanistic, it's very scientific, it's very quantitative, it's based on it's based on engineering. That's the type of stuff generative AI is really good at. So it's very conceivable that generative AI actually could, quote unquote, invent something that is essentially the concept for a finished product. So So now this guidance from the patent office is coming into conflict. Aaron, that's a great question. I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. Let's move on to the second little bucket here, which is privacy. All right. So I'll talk about privacy and data regulation for the moment in the EU, and then I've got a slide for the US. So there are some precedents in Europe. So Europe, as you might know, is a little bit, they have you could say they're either further ahead or they just have a more regulatory stance, whichever interpretation you want to take. So they have a little more precedent here. But there's another legal and compliance consideration actually that comes up from that, because that is that these services and generative AI and the data sets and the provenance of the data and things like that, this is SaaS stuff, this is cloud stuff. And so localization and jurisdiction is very problematic right out of the gate, right? So, if you're using Midjourney in the state of Connecticut, bound by US law, but you're using training data from Germany, it gets very messy, right? So there are a few bright lines in the EDU, specifically around GDPR. Now, most large organizations have to be mindful of GDPR, even if they're American organizations, because you're not just doing business in America. So Italy, for a while, banned GPT because they did not feel like OpenAI had adequate privacy protections. GPT accommodated this so that they could get the service turned back on in Italy. But GDPR is primarily about data controls, data privacy, and having a regulatory framework in place to assure for those types of things. So because AI is a data-centric type of technology, then the GDPR directly governs the data usage and the data privacy in the EU. So the EU has regulation matriculating through the courts right now. And so this is not a question of if, it's a question of when. So it's going to hit, right? So some mitigation strategies here. You can design tests for existing GDPR compliance. So if you get out ahead of this and you understand that this is a need, then you can test for this. You can also create controls for accountability, and you can design those controls in. Explainability and transparency is going to be, I think, one of the particularly tough issues to crack because of this black box problem. The deep learning, machine learning tools, they get so deep down in their processing that it can be very hard or impossible even to explain how they work. So that's an issue for audit, obviously. And then I think probably one of the biggest things we can do is watch the open cases and watch the existing lawsuits and just try to imagine, okay, well, if I'm doing this for my business or I'm using a service in this particular way, is there a way I can design that service or come up with controls such that I'm covered, even if the case takes a turn towards more regulation or takes a turn that maybe right now I might be at risk of not being compliant with. I mean, it doesn't mean you just have to not use the tools. It just means, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and stay informed. Now in the US, it's a little bit more wide open. So in the US, as it often is here, what we have is a patchwork of local laws. So there are some precedents. I'll give one or two examples of this very quickly before I conclude. But there just is not a holistic regulatory landscape here. So you want to make sure you're aware of which state you may be bound by, because some states have enacted legislation, but there's really not any holistic federal regulation right now, though they are looking at it. So again, in terms of to protect yourself here, you want to make sure you're paying very close attention, staying very informed. So just as you want to stay informed about the provenance of your AI applications data set, whether or not a provider who's providing you with some sort of service, even if it's like a third or fourth order service that integrates generative AI, and so many of them are, understanding the traceability and the provenance of that data. You want to stay informed about that and think about how you can structure that into your controls. You also want to think about the the open precedents there and stay informed about that, right? So a good way to do this, set up a team. You may have an existing compliance team or existing compliance stakeholders who can take this on for you, but those people need to understand these issues. And then finally, if you get out ahead of these issues, protect yourselves with a layer of governance and preparation that exceeds what the bare minimum might be, and that's a good way to protect trust. So not a lot to go on in the U.S. Just in general, these are some mitigation strategies that kind of cut across the lines of some of these buckets. I think I mentioned due diligence from service providers pretty well. Testing, and going hand in hand with testing is monitoring. So testing and monitoring, those are best practices for enterprise IT environments anyway. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. We have a lot to learn from kind of the DevOps community and the software engineering community. Next gen software teams are building very robust testing and monitoring into their pipelines, continuously testing and building quality in, monitoring the performance of the software. Generative AI at the end of the day it could be argued it's just a new fancy emergent type of software. So there's a lot of risk mitigation taken from that world that you can apply. I talked about the contracting. One thing I haven't mentioned quite yet, but it's very important, is that as I was researching and reading sources for this webinar, one thing I found that came up prominently was that because just user adoption is going to be so ubiquitous and people are just going to snap this up like fish bait so that they can get all the benefits from it. It's almost kind of like those basic HR onboarding trainings that we all have to take sometimes, right, to prevent us from getting our company's network hacked by hackers, by phishing scams, or ransomware. That's the word I'm looking for, ransomware. 35, 45-minute compulsory end user training, so that we have some level of protection against the ubiquitous risk of ransomware. Just making sure that we have thorough employee training in place. Now, I know not everybody likes those trainings, but they are there to serve a purpose. They're there to socialize and drive higher levels of awareness around just how ubiquitous and how dangerous ransomware can be. Whether or not that type of training is effective is a different conversation, but one way or the other, we have to figure out how to educate our people about the risks of just using generative AI. And then finally, taking it back around to the training data, think about that training data, think about how you can get around it, right? So that's that cross-cutting mitigation. So now I'm going to share with you just a few precedents. There's a few hypothetical precedents, and then I've got a few examples of actual precedents that are useful to look at. But these, I think, are some of the most prominent ones that are coming through. I won't read from the slide here, but you'll get these slides after the fact if you want to look into these more. And I actually do have references for these. But the first one is there's obvious legal considerations from the deep fake thing. Some of you may have heard about I think it was the New Hampshire primary deep fake election campaign call that went out. That was a deep fake. You immediately have ramifications for government, democracy. Christina had a great question in the chat. I see that, Christina. We have some real questions here related to governance, not just at a business level, but at a social level. AI has been used actually for a long time to detect things like fraud and malware. So that's a bit of a precedent that is fairly well established. Courts understand that there's very real criminal protection available from AI algorithms. So now that generative AI is generating new issues, that's a precedent that may be taken into consideration. Also, there are some emergent precedents related to AI, but there are existing precedents related to conventional IT security failures that will probably inform how the AI precedents are established going forward. But there can be liability in cases like this. So if you have a provider, a security security provider, for instance, or a subcontractor. I mean, I think about the atrocious SolarWinds hack of the government several years ago. I have to imagine SolarWinds was opened up to all kinds of liability because they fumbled the ball of the security for so many of their clients, including most public organizations and a lot of private companies too. So these are just some use cases that we'll probably see precedents coming down soon. A few others for you. Bias in data sets is something that's getting a lot more attention. But as these tools get adopted more and more into things that have real impact on real people's lives, there was a case of kind of old racially biased redline data being brought forward into automation training data for bank lending and so forth last year. That's obviously very problematic, right? Perpetuating 1950s style racial bias into training data sets. If nobody's watching that kind of thing, now you've got the machines automating and propagating the same kind of unethical bias that we legislated against decades ago. So just one example. Also, there's probably a whole other hour-long discussion just around the actual legal profession. I don't touch on that a little bit here yet, but the legal profession is one of those kind of a little bit like project management or any type of administrative work. It's an area where the AI tools are just really well suited to assist with that work, to automate a lot of that work, et cetera. But there's so much existing written content in the field of law that it's really easy for AIs to ingest and run that content. So we're starting to see things like bot agents who can dispense basic legal advice. WebMD was another example that I thought about. When you go and look on WebMD, you're even before generative AI, you're essentially already getting like machine curated medical advice there. So is that okay? We don't know yet. And then the involvement of these agents in things like contract law and generating contracts, is that going to be problematic? So a few actual examples here, not just categorical. But we have a few very few existing precedents. There was a situation here in which an attorney just used ChatGPT to write the initial legal briefs, and ChatGPT hallucinated and made up the precedent cases. And of course, that's another very serious ethical and legal concern with all of these tools, is that the tools make mistakes. They make mistakes, and so if there's not a human in the loop, if you don't have a way to confirm that what is being generated is factual and actual, then you could be perpetuating fiction essentially in the work. And so you can imagine all kinds of situations in which that could be really problematic. And then I mentioned already the USPTO precedent, but a federal appeals court did rule that AIs can't be named as an inventor. That's the kind of thing I think that is on a track to come to loggerheads with some of the most interesting potential of the AI usage. Maybe not as much with the humanities or with the arts, but when we get into the sciences and engineering fields, these AI agents are going to be able to create useful things. I think that's just, I don't think anybody in the AI community debates that. So how are they going to interpret that? But there is, for now anyway, there is that precedent. And again, I mentioned a patchwork of legal precedents against states, but we do have several states that have baked AI regulation into their consumer privacy laws. So there's some precedents there depending on what state you're in. All right, ethics and bias. We get into a slightly different spin here, but there is obviously a privacy issue here. This privacy issue comes up in a number of cases, right? Like you can use the AI to spy on people, or the training data may have private or sensitive information baked into it, as it did in the case of the Lion data set. But there's all kinds of examples and use cases here you can imagine where people didn't give their permission, they didn't give consent, You know, especially in places like the UK, we have a lot of surveillance there. There's a lot of cameras. We're already running facial recognition software and things like that on these things, collecting that data. That data is very useful for the generative AI applications, and it can get collected and you know, hoovered up and then used as training data, or it may just be infringing on people's privacy, depending on what the law says. And then I already mentioned that the algorithms, the models can inherit biases from their training data. So how to identify that? Like I said, there's always bias in the data sets in some form or fashion. So how are you going to control for that? Explainability, I mentioned this, the black box algorithms, the best and coolest AI tends to operate based on deep learning algorithms and neural networks. And these are the exact types of applications that nest the computer processing and the logic so deeply that it can become difficult, if not impossible, to be able to identify it, share it, or explain it. So, you know, especially if you're in a situation where you are required to have an audit trail or have traceability, then that can be very difficult. Who's accountable? This can be difficult. This has been a conversation that has been going on in the self-driving car world for quite some time, but that was even before the gold rush of generative AI. So, you know, it's just going to pour fuel on the fire. But, you know, you've got essentially a system there. It's the product of an inventor, a product creator. There's a software component. Some software may have been created over here. Some may have been created offshore. Then there's a manufacturing component. So you've got traditional manufacturing melding in with all kinds of other software systems and the AI itself. There may be yet another source for the training data. And if that self-driving car messes up and kills somebody, then who's at fault? I don't think there's yet a very good answer for this. And you know, so this is kind of a banner example from the self-driving car world. But these types of examples are going to start applying across all kinds of domain areas as the generative AI gets baked in. Human judgment versus AI autonomy. This is just a question of keeping humans in the loop. You know, we're already seeing autonomous agents. The prospect of autonomous AI agents on the battlefield and weaponry is kind of very terrifying. But we're already seeing some autonomous military technology. You know, as of yet, you know, the autonomy is limited in terms of pulling a trigger on something, but I think it's hard to dispute that it's probably going that way. You know, the flash crash on Wall Street a few years ago, I think, is a great foreshadowing precedent for this. So, you know, catching AIs when they lie or hallucinate or fabricate fictitious content, it can just get very tough to spot that stuff when it's moving very quickly. So, so that's another big ethical concern when it comes to generative AI. All right. Now I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and then I'm going to conclude with just a few words about cybersecurity, and then we will close this out. Okay, now, as I mentioned, cybersecurity kind of deserves its own conversation, especially when you overlay AI to it. But there's just a few points I wanted to make to get y'all thinking about it. There's a lot of use cases here, but you know, these are some of the ones that I personally enjoy thinking about a lot. And this kind of falls into like two different buckets. And so if you've ever dealt in a security or an IT security background or an application security background, or if you ever deal with people who specialize in this field, they watch the space very carefully, and they watch in real time what's going on. And so anybody who's in that domain will tell you that basically on any given day, it is the flip of a coin as to who is ahead, hackers and criminals or the cybersecurity community. So what that means is basically it is a constant arms race, and that arms race happens very quickly. And from one day to the next, you don't know who's going to be winning the arms race because criminals and hackers and people who would unethically exploit technology for their own criminal gain. They are smart, and they're always evolving, and they're always looking for ways to adopt the newest technology to beat the controls and to beat the protection. And then there's also a robust security community, and they're always working kind of on the white hat side to beat that. So, what we are seeing, or what we anticipate at least, is a similar dynamic when you enhance the cybersecurity dimension with AI, right? So that's kind of that two-pronged, black hat, white hat. Bad guys are ahead on Tuesday, good guys are ahead on Wednesday, etc. That's the dynamic to understand here. And it's a little freaky, to be honest, and it's a little scary. But when you pour AI onto this, the conventional wisdom is that the good guys probably got out of the gate faster because they were already using some machine learning and some algorithmic applications, like with the fraud detection that I mentioned. But now with generative AI, all of a sudden it's just so accessible that anybody from any corner of the world can leverage tools like that. So you're going to start seeing an arms race around AI enhanced both attacks and security. So AI can be a tool for protection against attacks, but AI can also be a weapon to be used for attacks. So I think just watch that dynamic, see what happens. And then the final point about it is that AI actually can be vulnerable to attack itself. So if a service or something is using AI for part of its functionality, then there are ways to hack AI. There's ways to trick AI. Those things could be exploited, and so that creates risk. And then obviously the training data, which I already touched on. Big, huge stores of data can be vulnerable to attack as well. So how to mitigate this? Here are some good ideas. How do you keep humans in the loop? Make sure you socialize and communicate and educate. Organizational trust is a precursor to this. But then you'll see it's so important that I've bolded it, and then this is related to the last bullet here as well. But think about where it all starts: the training data. So traceability, contractual agreements, and understanding the provenance of the training data that is fueling the features and the functionality of the AI tool. Just having data provenance accounted for, having that under controls, governed and formalized by policy, that should be a first-class feature of any tech stack that includes a generative AI feature. And then that goes hand in hand with data governance and management of the data lifecycle. I think I made that point pretty strongly at the beginning. All right, so we're about at time. I'm going to have to jump right at the hour today, so I'll just briefly sum up. Basic considerations: you got a few different buckets here, right? There's sort of ethics and bias as one bucket. There's a data regulation, GDPR, and privacy bucket. There's a legality bucket. There's a legal and compliance risk bucket here. And then there's just general risks that cut across all of these. And then a few other points to make from this slide here. It's good to understand the nature of the technology. And I guess that's a strong point I probably should have said earlier. One of the biggest things people can do is they should just use generative AI tools, right? One of the coolest things about generative AI is you get a sense for them very quickly if you use them. You can start to get a sense for what they're good at, what they can do, what they're not good at. What their limitations are, where they fail commonly. You get a sense of the pattern of what it's about. So people just need to use it. They need to use it, be informed, and have experience with it. But obviously, keeping pace is going to be a big challenge. Developing the frameworks is going to be a big challenge. Socializing these things is going to be a big challenge, and just keeping up with all the precedents that are flying around is going to be an extra layer of work that our organizations have to do. And then my final points, I think this is the last slide here. These are things you should and can do right now, pretty much today, to make sure you're already building a risk mitigation strategy when it comes to generative AI. check out these frameworks for ethical AI. It breaks these down, puts a framework in place and sort of get structure around how a formal framework can be put in place. I think I can't say enough about the data, the accuracy of the data. You can apply the framework principles to the data itself. This next point is about training data as well. But if you are able to, especially at enterprise scale, if you're able to use your own data as the training data or be in charge of your own training data set instead of relying on who knows where somebody else's open source data came from, that's a really good strategy. Now, we can't always do that, but if you can, that can be a potent layer of protection. You got to figure out how to keep the human in the loop. And then finally, you can't just deploy and forget. Models drift quickly, they age quickly. I can guarantee you this webinar and all my slide content here is probably going to be totally obsolete in like 90 days, and I'm going to have to update it because it's a fast moving space. So you got to continuously test and build quality in, and always build in feedback mechanisms. All right, so that's what I've got for you. I'm going to quickly hit a couple of the questions. Christina, I don't have a good answer for that, but I will just say I think it's a great question and we should all be thinking about it. We are seeing layers of accessibility and pay gates and things like that, and obviously like the really big companies are going to be building and leveraging the best, highest functioning, most powerful generative AI applications. Where does that leave the rest of us? Aaron had a question here. Is all generative AI work free use? No, not necessarily all of it. But a lot of it is, and sometimes that does include derivative work. So that's really something to keep in mind, right? If any part of work includes a component that was generated by AI, sometimes that means it's fair use, no matter if a lot of it was original. But there are some specific examples, and there's some specific examples where it's not necessarily fair use, but somebody else might own it. Like Microsoft, for instance, I think in the terms of use for GitHub Copilot, I believe, I should confirm this, but I believe they stipulate that the code product that Copilot creates belongs to them, not you. For Midjourney, the images that are produced by Midjourney, they are fair use. They're public domain. Boom, the moment that they're created. So it doesn't mean you can't use them. You can use them for whatever you want, but so can everybody else. So you just want to keep that in mind. All right. If you're putting words in to create a picture of DALL-E or Midjourney, is that human augmented AI? DALL-E, I'm not sure about. Midjourney, fair use. That I think there will be evolution in this space, but for now, Midjourney is fair use, and there's some variation across tools. So that's the best I got for you right now. All right, guys, thanks. I always love doing these. I hope you got something out of it today. Join us back for our next one. Laura, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's been so informative to hear all of this information, and I really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We probably didn't get a chance to answer everyone's questions, but please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn, reach out to us by email. You can reach me at Lara, L-A-R-A-H, @softdead.com. If you have any feedback, please do send us your feedback. We have more webinars coming your way. You can find our website, softdead.com, check out the Learning Hub, and you'll see the upcoming webinars there. So we do at least about 2 every month, and we're always happy to have everyone and send out our PDU codes afterwards so you guys can get your continuing education credits. I'm not sure if Chris already jumped off. I know he had another meeting, but I do want to brag on him a little bit. He's done the first couple deliveries of the AI for Project Managers course, and 100 NPS score, you guys. He got a 100 NPS score. You can tell he's got a wealth of knowledge to share. If you're interested in diving deeper on that topic, please do check out our AI for Project Management course. You can't go wrong learning with Chris. So again, if you have questions, concerns, please do reach out to us. I'll say goodbye for now. Look out for your inbox, and we'll send the code and the recording and the slides. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Chris.